Welcome to the world of advanced conversational AI. In this lesson, we'll develop our first OpenAI Chat Completion API call. We'll explore how this powerful API can transform your applications by enabling dynamic, interactive dialogue. The OpenAI Chat Completion API leverages the groundbreaking capabilities of models like the GPT and Omni models, allowing you to generate human-like conversational interactions within your applications. This API provides the interactive conversational AI experience most of us are familiar with, the AI responding to a user's prompts type scenario. However, by using the OpenAI API, you will be able to create these interactions with much more granularity and control. By using roles such as system, user, and assistant, you'll guide the model's understanding, enabling it to generate more customized and specific responses. Whether you're building a customer support chatbot, a virtual assistant, or an interactive storytelling application, the Chat Completion API gives you the flexibility to create immersive conversational experiences. With built-in features like temperature control for response randomness, max tokens for limiting reply length, and logit bias for adjusting word probabilities, you can adjust the model's behavior to meet your specific needs. These features will help you harness the full power of the Chat Completion API, and we will delve into all of them in upcoming lessons. Now that we have an idea about the Chat Completion API's capabilities, let's transition into writing our TypeScript codebase to interact with the OpenAI Chat Completion API. If you'd like to follow along, open the ch1ex1 branch in the course repository, and let's get started. In our project, we have two TypeScript files in our source directory, defs.ts for defining the messages and options components, and main.ts for the main script. First, we'll open our defs.ts file and import the necessary object types from the OpenAI package. We'll start by importing the chat completion message param symbol from the OpenAI library. Now that we have the correct OpenAI types imported, we can create our messages object, which is an array of type chat completion message param. This is our messages object, which will contain the key components we will use for our interactions with the Chat Completion API. Although it starts as an empty array, this object will soon contain the prompts, which will guide our AI interactions. Even though the project has very little code at this point, and our messages array is empty, we can go ahead and compile the code with the tsc command to ensure everything is working correctly. Once everything compiles, we'll add our first piece of content to the messages object, our initial prompt. For this, we'll add a single user role object and include the content, a query about Ada Lovelace's achievements. Here's the code. You can see it's a JSON object which has two required properties for this configuration, the role and the content. The role represents you, essentially the user entering a question into the ChatGPT website's prompt entry section. Thus, you are the user. The content is the prompt you want the AI to respond to. This is the content, i.e. the prompt you would type into the ChatGPT website's prompt entry section. So far we have imported the necessary OpenAI package, created the messages array, and added a user prompt to our messages array. Now, go ahead and compile the code with the tsc command to ensure everything is working correctly. Next, we'll go ahead and create our OpenAI configuration object. This object will ultimately hold all our OpenAI configuration parameters. In our current codebase, we have our messages array set up with a simple user prompt asking about Ada Lovelace's achievements. This is a great beginning, but what we need now is an OpenAI configuration object to hold our messages array and pass it to the OpenAI API call. We need this configuration object because, while the OpenAI Chat Completion API requires a messages array, the actual parameter to the function call is a configuration object which includes additional properties besides just the messages array. This object will include the essential properties required by the OpenAI API, starting with the model we'll be using. We will go ahead and declare our configuration object in our defs file just after our messages array. To begin, we'll set up the configuration object and name it OpenAI Configurations and create it as an empty object. Additionally, you'll notice we declare this object both with the const modifier and precede the declaration with the export keyword. Since we are separating out our configuration declarations and setup from the actual call to the API, to keep our code cleaner and more manageable, we'll be using separate code files and therefore need the export keyword in our declaration. Okay, now that you have your OpenAI configurations object declared, even though it's empty, go ahead and compile your code to ensure everything is working correctly. Once you've verified that everything compiles successfully, we'll add the model we'll be using for our chat completions. In our case, we will use the GPT 4.1 Nano. Since the OpenAI API expects all the configurations properties to be key value pairs, our model property will have the key, model, and a value of GPT 4.1 Nano. This property lets the API know which model to use when generating its responses. Next, we'll add the messages property to our configuration object. Here the key is messages, and the value of the property is to our previously defined messages array variable. While the messages key and value have the same name, keep in mind that one is the key in the configuration object, and the other is the variable we defined earlier. Okay, that's it for our configuration object's initial setup. Go ahead and compile your code to ensure everything is working correctly. If you run your code as it is now, you won't see the output that you might expect. This is because we haven't set up our main.ts file to use the configuration object we just created. And this is what we'll do now. Go ahead and open the main.ts file. Here, the first thing we'll do is to import our configuration object from our defs file. This is why we used the export keyword earlier. The import statement will look like this: import star as defs from defs. We use this syntax to make our code a little more readable, as this will make referencing any variable in the defs file require the defs prefix. We'll see this in use in a moment. Now, take a look at the main function. Here you'll see a temporary code block that we'll replace with our OpenAI configurations object. However, before we do that, if you've already run your code, you'll see here the prompt that you've been getting responses to. Let's go ahead and replace the temporary code block with our OpenAI configurations object. Here you can see how much cleaner and more readable our code is since we separated our configuration object. Now, go ahead and compile and run your code, and you should see a very interesting tidbit about Ada Lovelace. You now have a working OpenAI Chat Completion API call. We've covered the basics of setting up your project and the objects you need to make your first API call, including the messages array and some of the available roles. Then, we next set up our configuration object and set the model and messages properties. And finally, we integrated our configuration object into our main.ts file. That's it for now. As we continue our lessons, we will build on this codebase and continue to explore more capabilities of the OpenAI Chat Completion API. Stay tuned, and let's continue enhancing our AI-powered applications together.